all begins with your grandfather.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Those things that my grandfather found superfluous, unmanly, a stupid waste of time is probably how he would have put it, were punished.
My father was tough. He was tough on me. He was tough on all of the kids, but tough in a solid sense, in a really good sense. For her to say, I think the word she used was psychopath. What a disgrace. She ought to be ashamed of herself. That book is a lie.
Good evening. I'm Bob Costa, a national political reporter at the Washington Post, and welcome Mary Trump. Mary is a niece of President Trump and holds a PhD in advanced psychological studies from the Derner Institute at Adelphi University in New York. She is also, of course, the author of a new bestseller, a book that is highly critical of her uncle. It is titled Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. Mary, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mary, before he was elected, I used to go to Trump Tower as a reporter from time to time to interview President Trump. And every time I was there, I noticed a black and white picture of his father, Fred, staring at him on his desk right next to the phone he used all day. We saw that in the introduction of this program tonight. He later took that picture to the Oval Office. You saw that father-son dynamic over the years. Are you surprised he keeps that picture there every day?
Not a bit of it. In fact, it's I think one of the reasons Donald keeps it there is sort of as a reminder of how to behave in order to stay on his dad's good side, which seems weird because my grandfather's been dead for over 20 years.
Why does that relationship, the Fred Trump, Donald Trump relationship, matter in terms of his own presidency?
I think the simplest way to put it is to say that Donald continues to need to prove to his father that he's the tough guy, the killer, the best, that he's winning all the time, and above all, that he's not weak. And the ways to be weak in my family were to be kind, to admit mistakes, and to apologize.
You used the word tough there, Mary. Is that a word you heard a lot growing up? Is President Trump echoing his own father? Because we hear him use that word tough when he talks about world leaders, when he values people in politics. It always comes down to that word tough more often than not.
Yeah, and it's one of a few words that we hear repeated all the time. Strong, the best. Any word that conveys, quality or strength, or some sense of superiority.
The passage in your book about President Trump's time at New York Military Academy is interesting. Do you think that whole period in high school, really started in 8th grade, I believe, shaped him in a deep way and also shaped how he sees the military?
I can't speak to the latter. I think that might have had more to do with the way my grandfather saw the military as something that was not worth spending time on. My dad was a second lieutenant in the Air National Guard Reserve, and my grandfather wasn't particularly happy about the time it took away from the family business. I think one of the crucial things that happened during his years at the New York Military Academy was, on the one hand, it's when the bond between my grandfather and Donald started to deepen. By then, my dad was in college and then later, an adult working in my grandfather's company. And I think my grandfather already had some doubts about him. And over that 5-year period, he realized that Donald was a kindred spirit. And it was also a place that he learned the very crucial lesson that it's the people with the power who get to make the rules, no matter how they may have gained that power.
Mary, you write about the parents' decision to send him to New York Military Academy. You say Mrs. Trump, the president's mother, was not able to control him. He was out of control. Was there a
Yeah.
specific event, however, that led to that decision in the Trump family?
I think it was a series of things. So from a fairly young age, Donald was had a really hard time reading social cues. The rules in the house, my grandparents' house, were very different from the rules in school. So he had a difficult time adjusting to that. And as he grew older, he became more bullying and started getting into more physical confrontations, which obviously his school had a big problem with. And it was a combination of that and the way he was behaving in the house, particularly towards my grandmother, who just couldn't control him. And he acted very disrespectfully towards her and was a slob and never listened. So and my grandfather at the time was working a lot, so Donald's misbehavior didn't really affect him at all. So he wasn't particularly interested in intervening, but he wasn't particularly interested in dealing with it either. So sending him away probably seemed like a pretty good solution.
Yet, on one level, he's portrayed throughout your book as this cold figure, though there is this one line I found intriguing where you said Fred Trump Sr. went to visit Donald Trump almost every weekend, but
Yeah.
Donald Trump's mother, Marianne, did not. Who told you that story?
My grandmother. And it was, I mean, it was common knowledge in the family that my grandfather visited frequently. And, I can only speculate as to why, but I do believe that it probably had to do with the fact that, my dad just wasn't turning out to be the kind of person my grandfather believed he needed to be his heir apparent. Um, so otherwise, though, my grandmother told me that she didn't go very often because she was quite frankly relieved when he went away.
And in the beginning of your book, you talk about the president having to be told to put a picture of his mother up in the Oval Office. How would you
Yeah.
describe the relationship between the president and his mother?
It it was very complicated, but it started off badly. When he was 2.5, she became very ill and was unavailable to him emotionally or physically for close to a year. And as a 2.5-year-old at a very crucial developmental period, he of course experienced that as abandonment, even though it was of course not intentional and not her fault. But when she did recover to the extent that she did, she never really did enough to heal the rift that had occurred by her absence. And I think when she didn't lift a finger to keep him home, instead of sending him away from school, he probably considered that the final betrayal. And there was no real affection between them, and there was almost this sort of condescension. I think part of it was just that was the time. It was sort of sexism, the way he and my uncle treated my grandmother, is sort of a little bit of infantilizing, like she was this fragile creature, at least um, emotionally, that they had to protect. But it didn't seem particularly deep or sincere, unfortunately.
We hear so much about the president and his father. If you had to pick one quality President Trump shares with his mother, what would you say?
The sense of the facade being important to keep up.
What do you mean by that?
Well, my grandmother was very interested in the show, and how she came across and how she presented herself. And Donald certainly got that from her. I think it was very important that my grandmother be perceived a very particular way in terms of being charitable or generous. I don't think Donald cares about those two things necessarily. He has his own version of what he wants the world to see, but just in terms of the idea of who they want to be seen as opposed to who they really are. I think he did get that from her.
Mary, your book is not just a prism into this family, your family. It's a prism into a time, a city, New York, the 1950s, the 1960s. Take us inside a Trump family dinner table conversation, because as a reporter, I'm always trying to understand, did President Trump have his views on trade and immigration shaped by his father, or is this something he came to later? What do you remember about politics and what was discussed at that table?
I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. There was a sameness, and I think this is true in a lot of families. There's just like a sameness to how people interact and how holidays are celebrated, etc. But what I can say is that my grandfather had absolutely no interests outside of his business and the things that impacted his business. So generally speaking, all of the conversations were about New York politics, the state of New York real estate, connections, things that needed to deals that were in the works, or ways to get tax rebates, by giving away something to a particular charity. So it was always that kind of thing. Politics in terms of, I'm sorry?
What about race, though? I mean, this is the 70s, the early 80s. How did they talk about race, specifically your grandfather and your uncle, Donald Trump?
Yeah, it's a similar answer in the sense that there was such a sameness to it that I can't really pick out any one thing, but certain racist language was used rather casually and frequently. I can't pick out one instance because that would suggest that it was different. It was just sort of commonplace. And the same could be said of anti-Semitic slurs, and certainly there was a lot of misogyny as well.
Did anyone ever speak up and say, that's wrong, you shouldn't say that, that's offensive?
Oh no, I mean, because I'm not suggesting it was only Donald. It was accepted, and anybody who disagreed or had a problem with it kept their mouth shut.
Let's talk a little bit more about your book. We have a question from our audience. Mort Glassberg from Virginia. He wonders, quote, a lot of your book relates to events that took place before you were born. What are your sources for those anecdotes?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of it is sort of family lore, things that I've known forever, like the mashed potato story, for example. That's been told so many times by so many people, and I know it's true also because of how Donald reacts to it. He hates that story. But generally, outside of things I just heard from other family members, I've spoken a lot with my dad's friends from growing up and from college. Obviously, I have other people in my life who were around at the time, who have been able to confirm certain things for me. So I was very careful not to put anything in the book that I wasn't quite confident I could that was actually had happened, even if I don't always have documentation, but for the most part, I don't think it's necessary. When you're talking about a mashed potato story, I don't think we need a document proving it that it happened.
Right, and if you haven't read the book and you're watching this, Mary's referencing her father, her late father, Fred, poured a bowl of mashed potatoes over Donald Trump's head at a family gathering. She writes about how, in her view, it humiliated Donald Trump. and he remembers it to this day in a negative way. But Mary, let's pause on what you just said about your confidence in the
Sure.
family folklore, what you've been told. You recently
Mhm.
told ABC News that you were absolutely confident, your words, that someone else took the SAT for the president, but you never met the man you named, Joe Shapiro, and simply know it from a quote source close to the president. As you know, Pam Shriver, the former tennis star, has said it wasn't her late husband, Joe Shapiro, and you said it's now a Joe Shapiro from the neighborhood. Who is it? Is it? Have you done any more reporting? And if you were so confident in it, why did you put it in if it wasn't necessarily clear which Joe Shapiro you were referring to?
Well, quite honestly, because I don't think the identity of the person, and I want to clarify something. What I said was that Donald paid somebody uh, named Joe Shapiro to take his SATs. So that to me was the more salient fact that Donald paid somebody. And as for the identity of Joe Shapiro, it as far as I can tell, it's definitely not the Joe Shapiro who was married to Pam Shriver, because they met when Donald was at the University of Pennsylvania, and he paid to have somebody take his SATs when he was still at Fordham trying to get into the University of Pennsylvania. And as far as finding out who it is, I never would have met him because I don't think I was born yet, or I was very, very young. And two, the name Joe Shapiro is not uncommon in New York City. So the reason I'm confident is because I've been told this story by somebody who was there at the time, and was well aware that this happened.
Was that person Judge Mary Ann Trump, the president's sister?
I prefer not to say who it was, honestly.
Why not though? The person may have misled you though at this point. It's unclear if the anecdote's
You know,
spot on with
I
the Joe.
Sure, but I guess one question would be why, and the second thing is it's somebody who would have had absolutely no reason to make it up. It's a story I've heard before over the years. It's not like I just heard it, a few months ago, to be salacious. So I honestly, and to be honest, I also didn't think people would be all that surprised by it or interested in it. But I absolutely stand by it, and I would be curious to hear what other people in the family have to say if they were asked about it.
So you stand by it, but has anyone corroborated the story since publication?
Not that I'm aware of, and by the same token, I don't believe anybody's debunked it either.
I was struck, Mary, by Judge Barry, Marianne Barry, the president's sister. Her quotes in the book, very candid. She is critical of President Trump. It's clear you've had some private conversations with her. Was she
Mhm.
aware when you were having these private conversations that they would end up in your book?
No, I mean, most of those conversations took place before I was aware there was even going to be a book. So, no. Um, and, I wasn't, the conversations I had with her, were usually very we talked about all sorts of different things. So, the things that are in the book are just sort of distillations of much longer conversations that have taken place over the years.
Have you spoken to Judge Barry since the publication?
No, I have not.
Any plans to?
I don't, and I would not be surprised if she never contacted me, and I think that's fair. I understand why she would not want to.
So part of the release of this book has been a debate about your credibility as a witness to family history because of the dispute over your grandfather's estate in 1999 and 2000. Can you help us understand more of what happened at that time? Do you believe millions in the Trump estate right now are still rightfully your own?
I think what's most important to understand about what happened at that time was that the lawsuit was started as a lawsuit over the estate, over my grandfather's will. But the settlement was much more a having my aunts and uncles buy me out of my shares of certain interests I held in some of my grandfather's properties. So, at the time, I accepted their valuations of these properties, not just because they were my aunts and uncles, but because they had also been my trustees after my father died when I was 16. And it wasn't until, the New York Times, Suzanne Craig and Russ Buettner published that extraordinary piece of journalism in October of 2018 that I completely, well, not even completely, I still don't completely understand the extent of what happened. But, in 2000, I was told my grandfather's estate was worth $30 million. And in 2018, I discovered that it was closer to $1 billion. So it's very difficult for me to calculate because, again, I didn't have a share in the entire empire. But I think it's safe to say that there is a huge discrepancy between the numbers I was presented with 20 years ago and the numbers that we see now.
When you say huge discrepancy, can you give us any guidance? How much was the settlement?
I can't discuss that. Sorry.
It would just help give context, because if you say that Fred Trump Sr.'s was worth $1 billion and you had X amount as a settlement, it would be helpful to understand the gap.
Yeah.
We've never
Well,
heard. Yes.
I'm sorry. I think the simplest way to do it is, the difference if we're talking about a percentage of something worth $30 million or a percentage of something worth $970 million, we may not know the exact figures, but I think we can intuit that it's a pretty big difference.
Do you have any update on where this non-disclosure agreement legal fight stands between you and Robert Trump and others, your uncle Robert Trump, the president's brother?
I don't. I haven't heard anything since the last ruling, which hopefully is good news.
So you are a psychological professional. You describe your credentials throughout the book in making these assessments of President Trump. Do you know, however, if he has ever sought advice in terms of his own health or psychological well-being?
I don't. It would surprise me, but I don't have any inside knowledge about that at all.
You also just describe him more likely of drinking too many Diet Cokes, and he can't sleep. You also note that his own mother had trouble sleeping. Do you have any details about what was going on with President Trump's health as a younger man in any definitive way based on evidence?
His physical health?
Physical health or mental health? Beyond observation.
Sure. No, as his niece, I saw him frequently, and he always seemed like he was perfectly healthy, and there was no reason for me to suspect that there were any psychological issues at the time. I was young, so there was nothing stood out to me back in the 70s or 80s, but that could potentially be because he was, quite protected by my grandfather, his wealth and his power and his connections.
So there's no concrete detail. I'm just trying to understand. You're observing as a medical professional, but do you feel that you're taking any risk on making these assessments since he's not actually a patient of yours?
No, I don't diagnose him directly, and I also don't think the diagnosis matters that much. What I try to do in the prologue, and I also want to make it clear, I'm not currently a practicing psychologist. I've been out of the field for a while, but I went through 6 years of training. I taught graduate school. I saw many patients in clinical settings. So I'm quite confident in my ability to render certain judgments. But mostly what I was trying to do early in the book was to give people a sense of things that might be going on, to give people a picture of some of the symptomatology that we're seeing, and also point out the idea that there really is probably no single diagnosis. There's so much overlap. It's his behaviors are often complex and often seem self-defeating that, we need to dig a little deeper. And the way to do that, other than, obviously looking at his current behavior, is to look at his family history, which is something I believed I had some insight into. And as far as the Diet Coke thing, that's just something that I've heard many times. He drinks around a dozen Diet Cokes a day. That's not healthy, no matter who you are.
You got access to some of these settlement files that were then shared with the New York Times. As a reporter, I'm really curious, does Fred Trump Sr. have papers? Does your father have papers? Could these be accessed by the public or the press at some point?
You mean beyond the documents I have?
Correct.
I don't know. I would imagine that anything belonging to my grandfather and grandmother outside of what I had access to would be, in somebody else's hands. One of my aunts or uncles or one of their cousins. I don't know. And as far as my dad, he died so long ago. And when he did die, he really wasn't part of any of the business dealings anyway. So, like I certainly never saw any documents that belonged to my dad. He didn't even have a will.
Did you keep a journal or diary? Some of these conversations are so verbatim in the book about early experiences.
I have a really good memory, first of all, and secondly, I've had many conversations that confirm a lot of the information. So, it's easy to hang on to that stuff when it's important and relevant.
And one of the things that for anyone who reads the book is it's not really about President Trump. Of course, it's about him, but it's really
Mhm.
about your father. And
Yeah.
it's a sad book in many ways. Your father had a short life. And what was that experience like for you to dig into those memories and to tell his story really for the first time in this way?
It was awful, I have to say, partially because the man who was um, the professional pilot for TWA at the dawn of the jet age, the man who was so beloved by his friends and who, would fly them out to Bimini for the weekend to take them fishing, or out to Montauk to take them out on his boat, didn't exist by the time I was born. So I never met that man. And, I had a very similar view of my dad as the one that was perpetuated by my grandfather, which was that he wasn't accomplished. And, quite honestly, and I say this to my shame, that he wasn't worthy of respect. And he was basically the sum total of his disease of alcoholism.
And there was that scene with your father pointing a gun at your mother, horsing around, I guess, I don't know what else, other phrase to use. And you've recalled that was your first memory. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And the reason I know it's my first memory because it's the first thing I remember, but I know it happened because many, many years later, I mentioned it to my mother and she said, I can't believe you remember that. You were only 2.5. So she obviously remembered it. And it wasn't, he wasn't horsing around. He was quite drunk and it was a very bad time in his life. He was under a lot of stress and he was lashing out in a way that was terrifying and unforgivable, honestly.
Final question, Mary. Will you campaign for Joe Biden?
I don't know. I not officially, haven't spoken to anybody on the campaign, but I'll do everything in my power to make sure that Joe Biden gets elected. That I will do.
Mary Trump, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching this conversation this evening and for sending in your questions. We'll get to more questions whenever we can, but we did the best we could. Tomorrow, my colleague Eugene Scott will host a program on the reopening of K through 12 schools. And on Thursday, two contenders for the vice presidential pick, Senator Tammy Duckworth and Representative Val Demings, will stop by Washington Post Live for discussions. I'll chat with Senator Duckworth. And on Friday, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie will join me for a conversation about the campaign. But for now, have a good evening.